Giving your opponent extra resources or beneficial effects is always bad. Sometimes Wizards will use this to balance out incredibly strong effects. These cards tend to be either very strong or very bad, so today we're going to go over the best cards in the game that give your opponent a positive effect. Starting us off at number 10, we have Abyssal Persecutor. This is a 6/6 demon with a mana cost of 2 and 2 black. It has flying, meaning it can't be blocked except by creatures with flying or reach, and trample, meaning it deals excess combat damage to the defending player. It also has the ability where you can't win the game and your opponent can't lose the game. Persecutor is one of the more unique cards on this list. It essentially gives your opponent a Platinum Angel effect as long as it's on the battlefield. This means that in order to win the game, you'll have to find some way to get rid of your own Persecutor. And usually the easiest way to do this is to simply use one of your own removal spells on your Persecutor. This may seem really bad, but it wasn't enough to stop Persecutor from being extremely powerful in its standard format. A 6/6 with 2 very powerful evasive abilities was extremely good for only 4 mana, especially one that basically had no downside up front. This card could drop your opponent's life total to 0 in a hurry, and it's pretty much impossible to block favorably as most flyers are much smaller than 6/6. Once your opponent is at 0 life, they have to micromanage every spell you cast. At that point, your removal spell basically reads win the game. Most opponents can't really stop you from casting your spells, especially on your own creatures, as if they're not blue, they won't have access to counter magic. This means that the downside of Persecutor was more than manageable. Persecutor is one of the most unique cards in Magic. He only takes number 10 spot on this list because it's a bit debatable whether or not he qualifies for the list. But he's a great introduction to the ways that risk versus reward and ways that players need to find ways to circumvent these cards' downsides really plays out. And at number 9, we have Erhnam Djinn. This is a 4/5 Djinn with a mana cost of 3 and 1 green. It has the ability where, at the beginning of your upkeep, target non-wall creature your opponent controls gains Forest Walk, meaning it can't be blocked by players who control a forest until your next upkeep. Now, an interesting note about this card and why it specifies a non-wall creature. You see, back in the old days of Magic, the wall creature type used to have rules baggage. It used to be that if a creature was a wall, it basically had the defender keyword, meaning it couldn't attack at all. Now, most walls do have defender nowadays, but in the old days of Magic, the wall creature basically was the defender keyword. Lots of cards used to specify non-wall due to this, but Wizards has decided this just doesn't matter anymore and has discontinued this practice. Now, returning to Djinn, in the old days of Magic, there were a whole bunch of these overstated Djinns that had some sort of downside, like Erhnam Djinn. While a 4 mana 5/5 or a 4/5 isn't anything impressive nowadays, back in the days when creatures were much worse, this was a great rate. Giving your opponent to attack without being blocked wasn't heavy enough to stop just how efficient of a card Djinn was back in the day. The thing was, Djinn was usually the biggest creature on the field whenever you played it. So it didn't matter too much that you couldn't block, as you'd be able to deal more damage to them each turn than they could deal to you, so you would win the race. Needless to say, this card has fallen off. Nowadays, we got cards like Siege Rhino, a card with the same mana value and stats, but with 2 upsides, rather than a downside. Rhino was strong, but it wouldn't be broken or anything if it was reprinted in Standard. While Erhnam Djinn isn't particularly good anymore, it still makes this list for historically seen play. And at number 8, we have Hunted Nightmare. This is a 4/5 Nightmare with a mana cost of 1 and 2 black. It has Menace, meaning it can't be blocked except by 2 or more creatures. It has the ability where, when it enters the battlefield, target opponent puts a death count counter on a creature they control. Somewhat obviously, this is a counter that gives the creature the Death Touch ability, meaning any amount of damage it deals is enough to destroy a creature. Haunted Nightmare really puts Erhnam Djinn to shame, having the same stats and evasion while costing less. Its downside is also usually less relevant as well. You see, because the Nightmare has Menace, the Death Touch creature won't even be able to block it without another creature. This will let Nightmare get a 2-for-1 in a lot of boards. Really, the only situation where Nightmare's downside will matter is when you have other creatures you're scared about losing. And since you usually want to play Nightmare in an aggro deck, this can really hurt. Of course, you never have to deal with this downside if your opponent either doesn't keep the creature they put the counter on, or if they never had a creature to put it on in the first place. Using your removal spell to get rid of your opponent's best blocker is something aggro decks often try to do anyway, so making the blocker a little bit stronger before you kill it doesn't really change their plans. Even better, however, is a situation where your opponent's board is empty when you play Nightmare. There are lots of decks that don't play creatures early or don't play them at all. One of the most common ways Nightmare was used was in the sideboard as a card to bring in to punish decks that weren't playing any early threats. This made it basically an overstated creature with no downside at all. And considering that your opponent would still have to play 2 creatures to block it, it was a very imposing threat. This let the Nightmare see its fair share of play in the standard historic formats. And at number 7, we have Prosperity. This is a sorcery with the mana cost of X, meaning any amount of mana, and 1 blue. It has the effect where each player draws X cards. This card would normally be pretty weak, as this wasn't that good of a rate for drawing cards, and giving your opponent's cards was always way too costly. Not only did it give your opponent free cards to use, it actually gave them card advantage over you, because you have to use Prosperity from your hand and you draw the same number of cards as your opponent. You would end up one card behind them from using that card. On top of that, they didn't have to use any mana, meaning they're way up on tempo. Now, all of this has made Prosperity pretty bad in most metagame, but there was a metagame where it was a very, very powerful card when combined with a few specific cards. You see, while this card does give your opponent a ton of cards, it doesn't matter how many cards your opponent has if they're dead. Players found a way to use Prosperity in a combo deck called Bloom Drain. This deck uses cards like Cadaverous Bloom, an enchantment with a mana cost of 3, 1 black and 1 green, and has the ability where you can exile a card from your hand to either add 2 black or 2 green mana. And the card Squandered Resources, an enchantment with a mana cost of 1 black and 1 green that had the ability where you can sacrifice a land to make 1 mana of any type the land you sacrifice could produce. How the combo works is you would tap all of your lands for a ton of mana and exile every card in your hand to make mana, and dump all of them into a huge Prosperity. Let's just say you cast Prosperity for 10 mana, letting you draw 9 cards. Assuming you drew another Prosperity, you could exile the rest of your hand to Cadaverous Bloom and make 16 mana, then use Squandered Resources to make a blue mana. This would let you cast Prosperity to draw 16 cards. As you can see, every time we cast Prosperity, we draw more and more cards. Eventually, you can make 22 black mana to cast a huge Drain Life to kill your opponent. This combo was played in a format called Block Constructed, an old defunct format. Now, while this card was used as part of a very strong combo deck, it hasn't seen any play since then, as there were always better options, and this combo hasn't been good enough to see play in any older formats like Legacy. And at number 6, we have Donate and Harmless Offering alongside it. Donate is a sorcery with a mana cost of 2 and 1 blue with the effect where target player gains control of target permanent you control. Offering is exactly the same, but its mana cost is 2 and 1 red rather than blue. Now, obviously these cards don't do anything good on their own, but there are a ton of cards that have hefty downsides to them that giving them to your opponent could be very strong with them. Both of these cards saw competitive play alongside a card with a massive downside they can give to your opponent after it had outlived its usefulness. Donate was paired with the card Illusions of Grandeur. This is an enchantment with a mana cost of 3 and 1 blue. It has a cumulative upkeep of 2 mana, meaning each upkeep you have to put a time counter on it, and then you have to sacrifice it unless you pay the cumulative upkeep cost for the time counters on the card. It has the abilities where when it enters the battlefield you gain 20 life, and when it leaves the battlefield you lose 20 life. By donating this to your opponent, they would be stuck having to pay the rapidly increasing cumulative upkeep costs or have to lose 20 life, which would basically always kill them, as most decks can't go above their starting life total. You, on the other hand, got to keep the 20 life you gained while not having to pay for the Illusions of Grandeur anymore. This combo was used as part of a deck called Tricks, in the now defunct extended format, named after the bunny in the art illustrations as a reference to the cereal mascot. Harmless Offering was used in basically the same way. It was played with the card Demonic Pact. This is an enchantment with a mana cost of 2 and 2 black. It has the ability where, at the beginning of your upkeep, you choose one that hasn't been chosen. The Demonic Pact deals 4 damage to any target and you gain 4 life, or you draw 2 cards, or target player discards 2 cards, or you lose the game. How this deck, named Cat Pact, worked was you would play Pact and use all 3 of its modes that weren't you losing, and then give it to your opponent. Then, because the game still considers it the same pact, they would be forced to choose the Lose the Game mode, killing them during their upkeep before they even got to draw their card for the turn. Neither of these combos have seen much success outside their respective extended or standard formats, as the game is just a little bit too fast for these combos. Still, Donate or Offering might see play again if Wizards accidentally prints a card that kills you way too easily if you give it to an unsuspecting player. And at number 5, we have Howling Mine. This is an artifact with a mana cost of 2. It has the ability where, at the beginning of each player's draw step, that player draws an additional card as long as it's untapped. Mine usually isn't worth it. It has a lot of the same issues as Prosperity, where it's technically card disadvantage and requires you to pay mana, whereas your opponent doesn't have to spend anything. However, certain decks have found ways to make this effect one-sided or even an upside. One deck where the card has seen play is in Walks. This is a modern deck that played a ton of extra turn spells and tried to chain them into each other. However, you couldn't really do this while only drawing 1 card a turn. You need to draw both an extra turn spell each turn and a land so that you could slowly build up more mana to be able to play cards and win the game. In this deck, Howling Mine was incredibly strong. By letting you draw an extra card each turn, it would let you draw enough cards to play an extra turn spell on each of your many turns and slowly build up more mana to play even more cards like Howling Mine, or eventually do something like Awaken Your Part the Winter Veil to get a 6/6 beater to close the game. In this deck, Howling Mine is basically all a one-sided card, as you're the only one taking any turns and drawing extra cards. Another deck that Mine was really good in was an old deck called Howling Mine. This was a deck built around the card Ebony Owl Netsuke. This is an artifact with a mana cost of 2 and the ability where, at the beginning of each player's upkeep, if they have 7 or more cards in their hand, it deals 4 damage to that player. By using cards like Howling Mine, you can make sure your opponent's hand would always be full of cards, and Al would quickly be burning them to death. This was a very strong deck back in its standard format, though it hasn't seen any play in any other format. And at number 4, we have Wishclaw Talisman. This is an artifact with a mana cost of 1 and 1 black. It has the abilities where it enters the battlefield with 3 wish counters on it. You can pay 1, tap the Wishclaw Talisman, and remove a wish counter from it to search your library for a card and put it into your hand. Then you have to give the talisman to one of your opponents, and you can also only activate this ability during your own turn. Tutoring, as it's called by the community, is a very strong effect. Finding the perfect card for any situation is obviously very strong, but one of the main issues is finding your combo pieces. Combo decks can usually win right after finding all their combo pieces, which makes tutors especially powerful in these decks. It also negates most of the downside of Talisman, as if your opponent never untaps, they won't even get to use Talisman in the first place. Altogether, this makes Talisman an incredible consistency booster. However, the card hasn't seen quite as much success as you might expect. The issue is that in most formats, you're better off using other, slightly cheaper consistency enablers, such as the incredibly powerful cantrips Brainstorm or Ponder. With 4 copies of your combo pieces in your deck, and the slightly more non-linear combos found in a lot of decks in older formats, you're better off just trying to dig into your deck with 1 mana cards, rather than play a 3 mana tutor, especially since you may not have the mana you need to use it right away, as if you don't win right then, you'll be giving your opponent a tutor, which can be devastating. However, in formats like Commander, especially in the competitive side of the format, CEDH, Talisman is a great tutor. In that format, the combos are often more picky about what cards you can use, and since you're using a 99 card library with 1 copy of each cards, you absolutely need tutors to find the right cards. So, while Talisman's success in formats like Modern Legacy is a bit more limited than it may seem at first, it's still a very, very powerful card. And at number 3, we have Forbidden Orchard. This is a land with the ability where you can tap it to add 1 mana of any color, but whenever you tap Orchard for mana, target opponent makes a 1/1 colorless spirit creature token. Now, this card would normally be pretty bad. Giving your opponent a 1/1 is simply too high of a cost for mana fixing most of the time, especially with options like Mana Confluence, which only cost you 1 life available. However, there's actually a way to take advantage of your opponent having creatures. There's a card called Oath of Druids, which is an enchantment with a mana cost of 1 and 1 green, and the ability where, at the beginning of each player's upkeep, if one of that player's opponents has more creatures than them, they can reveal cards from the top of their deck until they reveal a creature card and put that card into the battlefield, then they can put the rest into the graveyard. This is an incredibly strong way to cheat out big threats, and Orchard is essential in that combo. You see, in order for this to work, your opponent needs to have a creature, and lots of decks, especially in Vintage, don't play all that many creatures. Orchard allows you to force your opponent to have a creature, allowing your Oath to trigger and cheat out your threats. And while giving your opponent 1/1 is normally a big downside, they're nothing compared to threats like Niv Mizzet Perrin or Grizzlebrand. This combo has let Oath of Druid combo decks be competitive for years in Vintage, the most powerful format in all of Magic. Considering how it helped create a viable deck in one of the strongest formats in the game, Orchard earns a spot on this list. And at number 2, we have Swords to Plowshares. This is an instant with a mana cost of 1 white. It is the effect where you exile a target creature, then that creature's controller gains life equal to that creature's power. Before we get into it, I should mention this card is standing in as a stand-in for all the removal spells that give your opponent something to replace the card you removed, such as Pongdify, Chaos Warp, and Assassin's Trophy. A lot of these cards have seen play at some point, but Swords might be the best of all of them. 1 mana to exile a creature is a crazy rate, especially at instant speed. Giving your opponent some life to replace it is basically nothing. Swords is usually considered the best creature removal spell in the entire game, as it exiles a creature, which is far better than destroying it, costs only 1 mana, and might as well not have any downside at all. Now, there are of course situations where you might want to play a different card. Prismatic Ending is more versatile what it can remove, for example, but nothing can quite compete with the raw efficiency of Swords. This card was printed all the way back in the very first set of the game, and despite all of the years of power creep and new designs coming out, nothing has usurped Sword's spot as the strongest removal spell in Magic. Despite this power, there are still a pair of cards that give your opponent something that are more powerful. And at number 1, we have Timetwister and Wheel of Fortune, as they're very similar. Timetwister is a sorcery with the mana cost of 2 and 1 blue with the effect where each player shuffles their hand and graveyard into their deck and then draws 7 cards. Wheel of Fortune is a sorcery with the mana cost of 2 and 1 red, and the effect where each player discards their hand and then draws 7 cards. These are 2 of the most powerful draw spells in the entire game. In fact, Timetwister is considered as part of the illustrious Power 9, a set of the 9 most powerful cards in Magic's first set. While the effect is symmetrical on the surface, it's very easy to make it asymmetrical. If you have less cards in your hand when you play Wheel, you'll be getting more cards than them. On top of that, since you'll be playing them on your turn, you'll be able to use all those cards you drew first. Even stronger, if you have a card like Narset, Partner of Veils on the battlefield, it will stop your opponent from drawing more than 1 card off of your wheel. This basically wins you the game on its own. However, you don't need to play it as a part of the combo for it to be powerful. Being able to refill your hand is amazing for any combo deck, as drawing 7 cards can easily find you one of your combo pieces. These cards have had multiple different versions trying to fix their effect, such as Day's Undoing, which ends your turn when you use it, or Echo of Eons, which has to be in your graveyard to be cast for the same cost as Timetwister, and these retrains have also seen competitive play. Weaker versions of these cards, like Windfall, are still banned in Legacy to this day, and let's not even mention Time Spiral. These cards are so powerful and iconic that all similar cards are called wheels as a reference to them. And they're pretty easily the strongest cards that give your opponent something. Alright, and that's the list. Are there any cards you think we may have missed, or have any ideas for future videos just like this one? If so, let us know in the comments down below.